The jungle was alive with death. The air, thick with heat, smelled of wet earth, cordite, and fear. It was 1968, deep in the heart of Quang Tri Province, Vietnam, where the line between courage and madness was drawn by the sound of gunfire. And somewhere in that green hell walked a 21-year-old Marine named Lance Corporal Danny Walker. He wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the loudest. But when chaos erupted, he would do something no one could ever forget. Something that would echo long after the last bullet was fired. Because on that day, Danny Walker walked into gunfire to save a man he didn't even know. The background. Danny grew up in a small town in Kentucky, a place where church bells rang every Sunday, and boys learned early that being brave meant never backing down. His father had fought in Korea, his grandfather in World War II. Service wasn't just tradition, it was identity. He joined the Marines at 18, full of fire and pride. But Vietnam wasn't the war he imagined. There were no clear front lines, no noble victories. Just jungle, shadows, and the constant hum of insects blending with the sound of distant gunfire. He'd been in country for 7 months now. 7 months of heat, blood, and letters that smelled faintly of home. 7 months since he last saw the blue Kentucky sky. His platoon, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, had been ordered to secure a small village suspected of harboring Viet Cong. It sounded simple, but in Vietnam, nothing ever was. The calm before the storm. That morning was strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. The men moved slowly through the waist-high grass, M16s ready, eyes darting left and right. Danny's squad leader, Sergeant Reed, muttered under his breath, "Stay sharp, boys. The jungle's got eyes." Danny tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the tree line. His heart pounded hard against his vest. He could feel the sweat running down his spine. Then, a bird cried out sharply, and the world exploded. The ambush. Gunfire erupted from the trees, a blistering storm of AK-47 rounds tearing through leaves, dirt, and flesh. Men dove for cover. Someone screamed. Someone didn't get up. The sound was deafening, a mix of metal, fear, and chaos. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Bullets snapped overhead like angry hornets. Danny hit the ground, mud splattering across his face. He returned fire blindly, shouting, "Contact left! Contact left!" The platoon was pinned down. Radio calls crackled with static. The lieutenant was shouting orders no one could hear. And then, through the smoke and trees, Danny saw him. The stranger. It was another Marine, maybe from another platoon. He'd been caught in the open, 50 yards ahead. He was down, clutching his leg, bleeding badly. Bullets kicked up dirt all around him. He was screaming for help, and no one could reach him. Reed yelled, "Leave him! We can't get to him!" Danny looked back, saw the fear in his squad's eyes. No one wanted to die for a man they didn't even know. But something inside Danny burned. That voice in his head, his father's voice, whispered, "A Marine never leaves another behind." He glanced down at his rifle, then at the man in the open. And in that moment, everything else, the fear, the logic, the orders, disappeared. He slung his rifle across his back and ran straight into the gunfire. Through fire. The world slowed down. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the bullets. He ran low, zigzagging through the grass, every step a prayer. Rounds snapped past his ears, one grazed his helmet. "Walker, get back here!" Reed shouted, but Danny didn't stop. He slid behind a small mound just 10 yards from the wounded Marine. He was pale, his lips trembling. "Help me, please." He pressed a hand to the man's wound, blood poured between his fingers. He tore off his belt, made a tourniquet, then looked around. They were exposed. The enemy could see everything. They needed cover. They needed smoke. He reached for a grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it forward. Smoke billowed thick and white, masking their position. He threw the man's arm over his shoulder and began dragging him back inch by inch through the mud. Each step felt like a lifetime. His legs burned, his lungs screamed. Bullets snapped through the smoke inches from his face. And then, the man was hit again. A round tore through his shoulder. He cried out, going limp. Danny fell to his knees. "Come on, Marine! Stay with me!" he yelled. He could hear his own voice breaking. He was so close, 20 more yards to safety. The turning point. A burst of gunfire ripped through the grass, forcing Danny flat. He could see the muzzle flashes, maybe 3 or 4 Viet Cong moving closer. He was out of smoke, low on ammo. He grabbed his rifle, propped it against a root, and started firing short bursts. Each shot echoed with anger, fear, and something deeper, a refusal to quit. "Come on, you bastards!" he shouted. Then, silence. For a moment, he thought it was over. He turned to check on the wounded Marine. The man wasn't breathing. He froze. Time stopped. His mind screamed, "No, not after all this!" He pressed his fingers against the man's neck. Faint pulse. Still alive. Barely. He took a deep breath, lifted him again, and stumbled forward. His body screamed in pain, but something stronger than pain kept him going. Just a little more. Just a little more.
When they broke through the last wall of smoke, the platoon saw them. 2 silhouettes staggering through the haze. Danny's uniform was shredded. His arm was bleeding. The man he carried hung limp across his shoulders. The Marines opened fire, laying down suppressing rounds as Danny stumbled the final yards, pulling the wounded man from his grip. Danny tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He's gonna make it, right?" The medic didn't answer right away. He just kept working. Pressure bandages, morphine, oxygen. Then finally, he looked up. Yeah, he's got a chance. Danny lay back, eyes closed, shaking. For the first time, he realized how close he'd come. There were holes in his flak vest, one through his sleeve. The round had missed his arm by an inch. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow. Hours later, when the shooting stopped and the jungle grew quiet again, the platoon counted the cost. 5 Marines dead, 8 wounded. But somehow, Danny had pulled a man out of a kill zone and lived to tell about it. Reed came over, crouched beside him, and said softly, "You're a damn fool, Walker, but you've got more guts than the rest of us combined." Danny didn't reply. He just stared into the tree line where the smoke still lingered. Somewhere out there, other young men were dying, on both sides, for reasons no one truly understood. That night, as they prepared for extraction, he finally learned the name of the man he'd saved. Private First Class Michael Donnelly, 19 years old, from Ohio. He didn't know him. They'd never spoken before that day. But their lives were now forever tied by the 30 yards of death between them. Months later, Danny made it home. He stepped off the plane into a country that no longer wanted to hear about the war. There were no parades, no cheers. Just protesters, silence, and the sound of his boots on the tarmac. He tried to forget Vietnam, but it lived inside him, in the dreams, and the thunder of passing cars, and the smell of rain on hot pavement. One day he got a letter. The handwriting was shaky. It was from Michael Donnelly. He had survived. Barely. He wrote, You didn't know me, but you saved me. I don't know why you did it, but because of you, I got to come home. I got to see my family again. I got to live." Danny sat there, reading those words over and over, until the ink blurred with his tears. Time moved on. Vietnam became history. But for Danny, it never really ended. He rarely spoke about that day. When people asked, he'd just say, "I was just doing my job." But those who knew him, those who saw the quiet way he carried himself, understood that something in him had changed forever. He visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. years later. As his reflection stared back at him from the black stone, he whispered the names of the men who never came home. He traced their letters with his trembling fingers, and when he found Michael Donnelly's name, now alive, now free, now a father and grandfather, he smiled softly. "We made it, brother. We made it." War creates strange kinds of heroes. Not the kind who seek glory or medals, but the kind who act when no one else will. The kind who walk into gunfire, not out of hate or duty, but because something inside them refuses to let another man die alone. Danny Walker was never famous. There were no headlines, no Hollywood endings. But in that brief moment, that impossible act of courage, he became something more than a soldier. He became a reminder of what humanity can be, even in the darkest corners of war. And so, his story lives on. Not written in books, but in the quiet gratitude of those who understand what it means to sacrifice without hesitation. Because sometimes, courage doesn't shout. It whispers in the heart of a man who chooses to run toward the danger, not away from it. He walked into gunfire to save a stranger, and in doing so, he proved one simple truth. He was more than a soldier. He was a reminder that true courage has no weapon.
The monsoon had come early that year. By June of 1969, the jungle was no longer just alive, it was breathing. Each leaf dripped with water. Each shadow carried the scent of death. And somewhere, deep in the heart of that green maze, Lance Corporal Danny Walker was preparing for what would become his final mission in Vietnam. It had been nearly a year since that day, the day he ran through gunfire to save a man he didn't even know. Since then, the war had changed him. He moved slower now, spoke less. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something quieter, a deep, heavy knowing. But the war didn't care who you were or what you'd seen. It just kept coming. "Charlie Company, saddle up!" The voice of Captain Harlow broke through the rain. They were heading north, into the A Shau Valley. The mission, rescue a downed American pilot before the Viet Cong found him. Intel said his helicopter had gone down after taking fire from the ridgeline. No radio contact, no signal flare, just silence. Harlow's voice was steady, but even he knew what that meant. The A Shau was enemy territory, thick jungle, narrow trails, and death waiting behind every tree. Danny sat on his pack, cleaning his M16, water dripping from his helmet brim. He didn't look up when Reed, now promoted to staff sergeant, crouched beside him. Danny nodded. "As good as anyone can be out here." Reed sighed. "Let's hope this pilot's still breathing. Command wants him back bad." "Everyone wants something bad," Danny muttered, snapping the rifle back together. The choppers came just after dawn, blades whipping the rain into mist. And as the Marines loaded up, Danny felt that familiar weight in his chest, that quiet voice that whispered,
You might not come back this time. The helicopters roared low over the jungle, the world below swallowed by green and shadow. Danny sat at the open door, watching the trees rush beneath them. The crew chief shouted over the noise, 2 minutes out! Get ready! The valley was narrow, boxed in by ridges and fog. When they came in low, gunfire erupted from below. The tree line lit up with muzzle flashes. Incoming, someone shouted. The pilot banked hard. Bullets tore through the fuselage. One chopper spiraled, smoke trailing from its tail.
Go, go, go! Danny jumped before they hit the ground, rolling hard into the mud as rounds cracked overhead. He scrambled behind a log, firing back toward the flashes. "Everyone down! Form a perimeter!" Reed yelled. They were scattered, half the unit on one side of the clearing, the rest still trying to regroup. The downed pilot's beacon was somewhere to the east, maybe half a mile away. And that's when Danny heard it, faint, over the rain and gunfire, a voice calling for help. He turned toward the sound. It was distant, broken, but human. "Help! This way! Please!" Danny glanced at Reed. "You hear that?" Reed nodded, scanning his map. "That's gotta be him. But it's deep in there, maybe past that ridge. Could be a trap." Danny looked back at the jungle. The voice came again, weaker now. "We can't just sit here," he said. Reed hesitated. "All right, you take 2 men, Alvarez and Brooks. Get in, get out fast. No hero shit this time, Walker." Danny almost smiled. No promises. The search. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, crouched low, weapons up, rain dripping down their faces. The air smelled of rot and gunpowder. Every sound felt like a heartbeat too loud. Alvarez whispered, "Man, I don't like this. Feels wrong." Brooks replied, "Everything feels wrong out here." Danny didn't speak. He just kept listening. Finally, they found the wreckage, a twisted Huey, half buried in mud and bamboo. The rotor was snapped clean, the cockpit burned out. Then they saw him, the pilot. He was alive, barely, trapped under the wreckage, blood covering his flight suit. One arm was mangled, his helmet cracked. Danny dropped to his knees beside him. "Hang on, buddy. We got you." The pilot's eyes flickered open. "You Marines?" "Yeah, we're getting you home." The trap. They hadn't been there 5 minutes when Brooks froze. He raised a hand, listening. A branch snapped behind them. Another. Alvarez whispered, "We've got movement. Multiple." Danny cursed under his breath. Viet Cong. They must have seen the smoke. He looked back at the pilot, pinned, bleeding. They couldn't move him fast. He turned to Alvarez. "Set claymores on the trail. We'll buy time." They worked fast, mud-slick hands, shaking fingers. Then the jungle exploded. Gunfire tore through the air, shouting in Vietnamese, muzzle flashes in the trees. Danny and his men returned fire, the sound deafening in the close space. "Brooks, cover left. Alvarez, get that pilot out." A grenade went off behind them, showering them with dirt and leaves. Danny fired until his rifle clicked empty. He saw movement, a shadow darting between trees, and fired again. Then silence. The sacrifice. Brooks was down, chest wound, not moving. Alvarez had taken a round to the leg, but was still dragging the pilot clear. Danny knelt beside Brooks, shaking him. "Come on, stay with me, man." No response. Just blood. He looked at Alvarez. "We're leaving, now." They half-carried, half-dragged the pilot through the mud, every step agony. The enemy was regrouping, shouting, growing closer. Danny turned, fired a burst into the trees, then tossed his last grenade. The blast echoed like thunder. When they finally reached the ridge, Alvarez collapsed. His leg was soaked in blood. Danny looked down the slope. The extraction zone was 100 yards ahead, but the VC were closing in from behind. He made a choice. He pressed his hand on Alvarez's shoulder. "You keep going. Get him to the bird." "What about you?" Alvarez asked, breathless. Danny looked back towards the trees. "I'll hold them off." "Walker, don't go." He turned, took a deep breath, and disappeared back into the jungle. The stand. He found a shallow ditch, loaded his last magazine, and waited. The rain fell harder now, thunder rolling overhead. He could hear them, the enemy, moving closer. He counted the footsteps, then opened fire. 3 went down. 2 more flanked right. He shifted positions, firing in short, controlled bursts. He wasn't thinking anymore, just moving, reacting, like the jungle itself had taken control of him. He felt the burn in his shoulder before he heard the shot. He staggered, looked down, blood. Another shot hit the tree beside him, spraying bark across his face. He dropped to one knee, fired again. "Come on," he yelled. "Come and get me." They did, and for a few minutes the jungle was pure chaos. When the choppers finally roared overhead, the sound was like salvation. Reed's voice came over the radio, faint but urgent. "Walker, we're pulling out. Where the hell are you?" Danny pressed his hand to his wound, breathing hard. He looked toward the sound of the rotors, then back at the jungle. Enemy movement still closing in. "I'm here," he said quietly. "Just buying you time." The rescue. Minutes later, Alvarez and the pilot were lifted into the chopper. Reed scanned the tree line, shouting into the headset, "We're missing one! Walker's still out there!" "We can't stay, sir. We're taking fire," the crew chief yelled. Reed clenched his jaw. One more pass. As the Huey banked low over the ridge, they saw him, Danny Walker, dragging himself through the mud, one hand clutching his rifle, blood trailing behind him. Reed leaned out, shouting, "We got you, Marine! Hang on!" They dropped the sling. Danny reached for it, hand shaking, but his strength was gone. The world tilted. Then, a hand grabbed his wrist. Reed's hand. "Not this time, Walker. You're coming home." They pulled him up, bullets snapping through the air, the jungle fading below. As the chopper lifted out of the valley, Danny looked down one last time, at the trees, the smoke, the bodies, and felt something he couldn't name. Not victory, not pride, just relief. The hospital. He woke up 2 days later in a field hospital near Da Nang. His shoulder was bandaged, his arm in a sling. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Reed was sitting beside him, smoking quietly. "You should be dead, you stubborn bastard." Danny managed a weak smile. "Told you I wasn't done yet." Reed chuckled, then grew quiet. "You saved them, Walker. The pilot made it. Alvarez, too." Danny stared at the ceiling. Brooks didn't. Reed's voice softened. "No, but he went down fighting. Like you." Danny nodded slowly. He didn't feel like a hero, just tired. Tired of the jungle, the killing, the ghosts. The reflection. Weeks later, when he was cleared to leave, Danny stood by the runway, staring out at the horizon. The sky was red, the color of dusk and memory. He thought about all the faces he'd seen, the friends he'd lost, the strangers he'd saved. He thought about that pilot, alive because of a choice he'd made in the rain. He realized something then, something war had carved into him, that courage wasn't about not feeling fear. It was about feeling it and walking straight into it anyway. He looked down at his bandaged arm, flexed his fingers, and whispered to himself, "One more day. That's all any of us ever get out here. One more day." Then he turned toward the waiting chopper, ready to go home, although part of him knew he never really would. He would survive Vietnam. He would grow old, have children, tell stories, but never this one, because some acts of courage aren't meant for applause. They're meant for remembrance. And so, the legend of Lance Corporal Danny Walker, the Marine who walked into gunfire not once, but twice, lives on in the quiet hearts of those who understand what it means to risk everything for someone you barely know. He was more than a soldier. He was the kind of man who made humanity possible in a place built to destroy it.